Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is January 18th, 2010, and my guest is Michael Spence, a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, the chair of the Commission on Growth and Development, and the 2001 winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. Mike, welcome to EconTalk.
I'm delighted to be with you, Russ.
I want to start with your work on the Commission of Growth and Development. The Commission started in 2006. Give us a little background to start with on what its mission was and how it's unfolded.
Well, I think the mission had really two parts. One was a feeling on the part of the people who eventually became part of the Commission that the importance of growth as an enabler of the achievement of a number of objectives, poverty reduction, and a lot of the MDGs had been sort of lost. And people were focusing on trying to solve important problems that people care about in the developing world, but many of them are pretty difficult to deal with without the tailwind of growth behind you. So that was one of it. It was never meant to be negative with respect to the very important achievements that had been made in the areas of education, health, and other things. So I think of it as complementary to that. The other thing is that, since the Washington Consensus, which came together around 1990, late 80s, 90, there's been a lot of experience accumulated in the developing world. India had accelerated. China had been accelerated earlier and been growing very rapidly. And growth had turned up in a number of parts of the world after a long hiatus in Africa, in parts of Latin America, and we thought that experience and some good complementary academic work ought to be reviewed, and we ought to try to assess what we'd learned and what we still didn't know about growth and development.
Talk briefly, for the listeners who don't know about the Washington Consensus, what the outlines of that were.
Washington Consensus was put together principally by a man named John Williamson, but he had colleagues. And it was an attempt to try to understand what the key sort of necessary criteria which had to be met in order for a developing country to grow and develop. And they put together a list of things that, even to this day, seem really quite sensible. And that list has been expanded over time. The problem with the Washington Consensus wasn't the idea, it was the way it was interpreted. It was interpreted as a set of sort of policy actions, if you like, by government, or a strategy, if you want to put it all together, Russ, that if you did that, then you were pretty much assured you'd grow, and that turned out not to be true. So the misuse of the Washington Consensus was as a kind of formula, a kind of one-size-fits-all view of the world that people took to be the kind of necessary and sufficient conditions for growth, to use scientific language. And now, I think most of us think of them as a pretty close approximation to necessary conditions, but the part that's missing is the sufficient conditions part.
And these were.
And then let me just add one thing.
Sure.
Then the problem really was in the application. This got turned into a prescription for a very limited role for government in many parts of the world, including Latin America. A kind of, the market will take care of most of it, and if the government gets beyond a certain minimal size, it'll start making mistakes and making things worse rather than better. And that, I think, was not what was intended by the framers of the Washington Consensus, and it certainly isn't the way people think about it now. I think the President Obama, in his in his inauguration speech, put it bad. The issue isn't whether the government's big or small, but whether it's effective in doing the things that require collective action.
So the Washington Consensus was an emphasis on markets, rule of law, private property, but also a restraint on government spending to some extent, partly because so many would-be developing countries didn't spend their money very wisely, I think. And I think you're right. It got interpreted to mean little or no government rather than wiser government.
Yeah, wiser, better government. I think that's a very good summary, actually.
Of course, wiser government's pretty tricky. We're not so good at that.
Very tricky.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, if I turn to what I learned from working with these the other commissioners, they are mostly very experienced political and policy leaders from the developing world. A few exceptions. Bob Rubin was a member. He's obviously a former Secretary of the Treasury. Bob Solow, founder of modern growth theory and a Nobel laureate, was my fellow academic on the commission. So I went into this thinking this was fairly complex, sort of dynamic economics, if you like, and economic policy. And I came out of it thinking that this is an awful lot about government and governance and getting things started, and really wasn't best thought of as entirely economics.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the commission is, as you say, I think you and Solow were the only academic economists. There were 20 other commissioners. There's 22 commissioners altogether, most of whom were from, quote, the real world.
Yeah, and the real developing world.
Which can...
former presidents and prime ministers and heads of central banks and so on.
And I would have predicted in advance, and be interested in your take, would have predicted in advance that it would be hard for those folks to be brutally honest. It's hard for academics too, but it seems particularly difficult for politicians. Did you find there was a lot of political infighting in the commission itself?
No, I didn't, actually. I think it's harder for these folks to be brutally honest when they're in more public fora. But the commission, we didn't try to hide from the public, but it clearly wasn't sort of like a meeting of the ASEAN finance ministers or something like that where you're speaking for your country. These people who are very smart and very experienced were speaking for themselves, and then the output, was the commission's output. People can disagree with it. So I didn't find much of that at all. What I did find is that their experience and their own thinking didn't always lead them to agree on various matters, and there are some very controversial aspects of growth and development policy. Well, we just decided at the start that when we didn't agree, we just say we didn't agree, and then try to explain why, because we thought the explanation might be actually sort of informative. So that's how we handled that.
So you produced a report about 2 years after the commission was started in 2006. In 2008, a report came out with a set of analysis and recommendations, and it has a sentence in it I found rather startling, and I think it's the first, might be the very first sentence of the overview. It says, since 1950, 13 economies have grown at an average rate of 7% a year or more for 25 years or longer. So as you point out, and is obvious to anyone who knows the rule of 72, that means if you can grow at 7%, you double the size of your economy every decade. So if you can do that for 20 years, you quadruple your size in 20 years. 30 years, you eightfold increase. So what did you learn, and what did the commission come up with as the secret to at least these economies that grew so dramatically?
Well, first of all, we learned really two things, Russ. And I should emphasize, you don't want to overgeneralize from the successes. You need to look at the failures and the kind of also-rans as well if you want to get a complete picture. And we understood that, but we really used this as a device, for kind of trying to highlight some things. So what are the two things? So one is that the openness of the global economy, which increased steadily by policy, wise policy on the part of the United States and the European Union and the advanced countries after World War II was the enabling factor. And it has two parts. It has huge markets for developing countries that can find a place in them, and it has a lot of knowledge that they can essentially import. And that bringing knowledge, whether you call it's technology, it's management capability, it's a whole lot of things that are the underpinnings of a modern economy, that increases their productive potential much, much faster than you can do this on a standalone basis. Or for that matter, much faster than the advanced countries can do it, even though we're pretty innovative as a group. And so that's the first thing. The global economy makes this possible, and it's overwhelmingly the dominant factor, more than aid, more than almost anything you can name. And then there's a whole lot of things that go on inside an economy, some of which are political and some of which are economic, that take advantage of that favorable external environment. The things on the economic side, I think we picked off very high saving and investment levels are critical, including on the public sector side. So the government has to make certain kinds of investments in things like infrastructure and education, without which this really can't happen. So those are crucial, and high is really high. 25% or above of the gross domestic product, or think of it as gross national income. Not quite the same thing, but they're close. The public sector, is under pressure in a poor country, and so investing there 5, 7, 8% is a non-trivial commitment of resources to the future rather than the present. And for that, you have to have a supportive population, regardless of the form of governance, and that takes leadership. People will make those sacrifices, I think, if they think there's really a good chance their children and grandchildren are going to be better off than they are. There's lots of evidence that people do that, but they have to believe. They really have to believe two things. They have to believe it's possible, and they have to believe that they're kind of all in it together. There's an inclusive element of this kind of thing that's absolutely essential.
I want to talk about those two aspects of public activity, and then I want to come back to globalization because I think it's so interesting. Let's start with those two areas of government activity. There are many poor countries when we think of infrastructure in the United States, we think about bridges, tunnels. In poorer countries, it's much more basic than that, is my impression. There are things, major basic problems like you can't get the crop to the port, or you can't bring stuff from the port to the people because the roads and you can't even use a real truck in some places. So that part of infrastructure I understand. The educational part, though, I find harder to understand. Certainly we know many cases where countries have poured money into education with no return because they didn't get education. They just spent money on it. It's a little ironic for the father of signaling theory, which downplays the role of education as increasing in human capital and emphasizes its role as a signal, to talk about its importance, at least in developing countries. So talk about both of those factors, the infrastructure and the education part.
Well, these inputs are more like requirements, so that if you have one but not the other, you tend to it slows you down. To use the language that you'd use talking about growth. But it's not surprising that the economic development tends to start on the coasts or around rivers, and this has been historically true because the infrastructure in some sense is already there, or part of it. That's certainly true in the China case, but there are many examples. Paul Collier, with you've had a long chat or two, points out that there's a lot of landlocked states in Africa, so the infrastructure is a particular problem there, and it's infrastructure that has to be constructed on a regional basis in order to solve that problem. So, and it's a major challenge. Infrastructure is expensive, and in a poor country, it tends to get pushed aside by more pressing, immediate, urgent problems, disasters, famine, the health of the population. I mean, these aren't trivial things, but the crowding out effect has a dramatic effect on long-term growth. And the successful cases are, in some sense, the most surprising. I mean, most of these countries, Japan's an exception, were not relatively, very poor when they started growing. And China, had per capita income sort of at the low end, of the spectrum. Korea was very poor. Singapore was a very poor fishing village. So a small subset of these countries managed to sort of corral the resources to make the investments and to start the growth process. But it's a big sacrifice and a tough choice. And I think in order to make it, you required really inspired leadership in most cases to get it done. Even if you don't like the political system, sometimes the leadership is important. On the education side, the academic studies of education using data, the cross-section studies, turn up a huge variety of results ranging from important to unimportant. And I think the reason is that the specification of the model is too hard. It's too complicated, how this interacts with something else. But the one thing that is true is what you just said, and I want to underline it, which is there is a tendency to measure your commitment to education by inputs, how much money you spend on it, how many kids are enrolled. But when you go and measure the outputs, which has been done now on a multi-country basis, you get surprising and disappointing results.
Yeah.
So you don't always get very good output in the sense of cognitive and non-cognitive skills development in young people for that investment, and that's a real problem. It's ubiquitous. It's pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, well, it's true in the United States, even, of course, and one of the reasons it's true, I feel, and I get your take on it, is we often give it away, and in my experience, people don't treat things they're given with the same care as things they earn. And although I understand the argument for subsidized education, I think the argument for free education is particularly uncompelling, and it almost guarantees that people will not treat it as valuably as they would if they had to work for it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I actually agree with that. And the data would, data in the general sense would support you. In many countries, there's a private family commitment to education, monetary and other, that's significant in the places where it seems to be working pretty well. There's lots of things that get in the way. I mean, in India, in a number of states, you find that teachers are public employees. Nobody really monitors carefully what job they're doing, and there are no-shows. So it sort of reminds you of the old political machines in certain American cities. The kind of patronage system. In other cases, young women don't get to go to school because when the family's under pressure, they're the ones who are pulled out, and so it's actually it's a complex challenge to sort of up the efficient quality of the educational process, but it's kind of first order importance in many countries.
Let's go back to globalization. As you said in the very beginning, you don't want to just look at the winners. You also want to look at the losers and the also-rans. Are there any examples of countries that have cut themselves off from globalization, the global marketplace, and have been successful?
I think the answer to that is no. At least we weren't able to find any. You can let me qualify it slightly. You can cut yourself off or partially cut yourself off and try to use the domestic economy's supply side in lieu of competition from the global economy. And for a while there, lots of people thought that was a good idea. That turns out to run out of gas after a while. And so it may look like it's working for a decade or so, but it's not going to work for 25 years. And the reason is that you pay an increasing price in terms of cost or efficiency by taking that route. And there's examples of that even in the advanced countries. I grew up a lot in Canada. And Canada and Australia and New Zealand all had very high tariffs and a kind of import substitution policy to develop their industrial sectors, and they've all abandoned them in various ways because the cost got too high. And you can even measure the cost. I mean, you look at the amount of protection you require in order to have an automobile industry in one of these countries on a standalone basis so that the outsiders can't compete. You end up with tariffs of about, or effective rates of protection of 80% and whatnot, and eventually it just is too expensive for the citizens of the country to support this strategy anymore.
What's fascinating about it is you lose the economies of scale that you could potentially have, and you also lose that competitive edge. And when you said you runs out of gas, I was thinking about the United States, where the big three. You'd think, well, in a lot of industries, three competitors is plenty. They work really hard to try to steal market share from each other and innovate. But in the United States, something happened in the auto industry in the 50s and 60s and even 70s where they were evidently relatively cozy. And a little competition from the Japanese totally transformed that industry and forced the big three to work a lot harder. And some of them couldn't do it, as we can see right now. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, there is the one thing in a developing country that is a sort of, I would call it a subtle aspect of policy is you want to have the objective of being open and fostering competition, but it is possible to do it too fast. If you have relatively inefficient sectors, and then expose them to global competition too fast, the Humanitarian job destruction as opposed to job creation can get out ahead. And then you've got problems, of not only economic problems of sort of unemployed people and poor people, but you've also got political problems of support for the growth strategy. So you generally see countries that are succeeding going in the right direction, but they do it at a measured pace is the way I would describe it. But that doesn't gainsay anything you just said. I have to say, we didn't make it easy for the automobile companies, and not to take responsibility only on the public policy side, but a lot of these companies operate globally and build cars for markets where the prices of gasoline and oil are a lot higher. That's a good point. Yeah, that's a great point.
Of course, our companies could have done the same thing too, but I think they got smitten by the size of the domestic market in the United States and sort of caught.
It's a very interesting, managerial cultural dynamic what they were dealing with and the politics. I agree.
Absolutely.
I lost my train of.
You get scale economies that you get going back to sort of Adam Smith. You get sort of there's this mysterious concept to the public that economists use called comparative advantage. It just means what you can compete in relatively, what you're relatively good at. And the countries that grow very fast are supplying the global demand, and the global demand's so big they can specialize in those things. So the advantage you get from the global market is a combination of scale economies and this advantage from being able to specialize in what you're comparatively good at.
Yeah, I think we've talked a little bit about this before on this program, but I think seeing the potential for a enormously large pin factory that sells to a big portion of the world market and thereby takes advantage of enormous specialization and the application of capital to each stage of the process is the road to credible productivity.
Yeah, no, it is the road to credible productivity. It's also a road to vulnerability. I mean, you know, when you do that, you're dependent on the global economy, and if it does something bad or it gets into a muddle as it did in this crisis or some other things, so there's risks associated with it as well, and I think it's important to be honest about them.
No, that's true. If you're cut off from the global economy, you tend to have a lower variance, but you don't get much. The meat's not very high. It's a tough trade-off. Talk a little bit about corruption, because it seems to me that one of the challenges in all of these stories about the role for the public sector being the right size, being big enough to cover, say, infrastructure without getting into trouble. What role does governance play in success and failure?
Well, governance broadly defined plays an incredibly important role, and wholesale corruption is, meaning grand theft, so to speak, is devastating because there just aren't that many resources in relatively poor countries. So, if a good chunk of it is going off to banks in Switzerland or the Cayman Islands, it's a major problem. And, again, you've talked with Paul Collier and probably others, but in natural resource wealthy economies, it's very easy to have the politics or the political economy turn to try to capture the natural resource wealth or the income from it and away from things that look more like, long-term growth and the long-term interests of the broader population. So that's a major issue. And when it's been done well, it usually takes generous and effective leadership, as in the case of Botswana. I mean, the Prime Minister or President of Botswana came from the tribe where the diamonds were found and went to the tribe. They had in Botswana, a fairly well-developed collective decision-making process at the regional and tribal level. And he said, look, I mean, we really got to make sure these belong to the country. And you can imagine that was a fork in the road. I mean, a country that, where a tribe sort of says the diamonds belong to the country is a country that's kind of off in the right direction, and the other road isn't very nice. It's kind of a pitched battle for the incremental wealth. Unfortunately, there's not the standard story.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating counterexample to the standard story. It makes me think, I never really thought about this before, that natural resource wealthy countries have the fact that the resources that this potential cash flow is in a very geographically limited place is what makes the competition to control that so fierce. And we have the advantage in the developed countries that our greatest resource is highly dispersed. It's in the brains of millions of people. Right. And the most you can extract from it is, via the income tax, which we're pretty good at. But it's not like what people can do to oil and diamonds.
No, that's exactly right. And, if you go back to the 1950s, people in my profession, when asked, where in the developing world were things going to go pretty well, they said Africa. And when asked where were they going to be a major problem, they said Asia. And so that was sort of dead wrong. And the reason is that we underestimated the importance that would attach to the human resources if properly developed.
Yeah.
And the difference between Asia and Africa was that many of those countries, all they had was people. So they sat down and tried to figure out what were they going to do with this asset, or how were they going to make this asset more valuable, both to the country and to itself. It turns out, kind of sustained creation of wealth and prosperity, really, in the end, it can be materially augmented by natural resource wealth of a variety of kinds, but in the long term, it really does depend on people, learning, institutions, and innovation.
So let's talk about policy and how we might get more than 13 economies to grow at more than 7%. There's a long list in the denominator to join and do better. And I've become, partly from reading, partly probably from my biases, partly from interviewing folks like Paul Collier and William Easterly, I've become extremely pessimistic. Collier's not, but I've become extremely pessimistic about the ability of outside influences to do anything in the short run for the poorest countries in the world. There's no evidence that we can help them. There's hope, but there's no evidence. Can you cheer me up a little bit? Can you give me some optimism or your take on what we've learned from the last 50 years? Most of the things we've tried, aid in particular, have not worked particularly well. In fact, they appear to me to have made the problem worse. Other than opening our borders and trading with lots of people, is there anything specific that the so-called West or developed countries can do for the poorest nations in the world?
We can do a lot in humanitarian terms, but I think that you're basically right, that there isn't any evidence that we can do a lot if things are going badly internally. And the reason for that is that even countries that, are going badly, where the people are genuinely unhappy, still think it's their business. And in some deep sense, given that we're organized as nation states, that's right. And so external influence, if you like, or interference is a kind of more provocative way of putting it, is not widely accepted, even for poor countries. So when it's a humanitarian disaster, either man-made or by forces of nature, then I think the argument changes. But that's not growth and development. That's responding to something much more basic.
It's palliative.
Bill Easterly and I apparently don't agree on much, but I actually agree with him on that. I think where we probably part company is on how to think about the role of the state in this process. I think of government as effective government and effective leadership is an important input, and so is the sort of private sector dynamics, entrepreneurial spirit and so on. When those come together, then you get a pretty powerful combination. But my impression is Bill thinks that the Commission sort of overemphasized the state as the kind of planning entity.
Well, to hear your earlier remarks that it was in some sense a reaction to an overreaction to the Washington consensus, I think it's an interesting perspective. I think it seems to me the challenge is one we could call a selectivity bias. If you look at the successful states, their governments are fairly well run. It's hard to understand. I don't think we know much about how to get from A to B, how to get the countries that are corrupt or badly run to become those better led or more effectively governed countries.
No, we don't. And in some sense, when I was asked that question, I basically gave your answer in response to a question. When somebody would say, what are we going to do about that? I would say, who's we?
Yeah.
So I think that part is essentially right. On the other hand, in order not to be too pessimistic, demonstration effects have enormously large impacts. There's lots of examples of that. In the case of China, Deng Xiaoping went to Singapore and then New York, and it just opened his eyes with respect not only to what was possible, but how you go about it, why the market was so important, and so on. Russ, are you still there?
Yeah, no, I'm just listening. I think it's the Chinese experience is a fascinating one.
India has clearly, a country like India, isn't necessarily going to be influenced by the developments in Europe or North America, but a big neighbor, where the argument is that, that kind of similar in size and population and so on, has a big influence, even if it's just motivational. These big countries, especially China, are now starting to have an impact on the developing world, both in knowledge transfer and in using their resources. Now, people worry about the kind of international political economy of that, and for good reason, but that's all starting to happen, and, to be fair, as a result of nation and identity building, adapting policies so that they're better, paying more attention to distributional issues, growth really did pre-crisis, was in a period of rather broad expansion. So there's a reasonable, I think, basis to hope that we can return to that pattern in the post-crisis period, and that these 13, even if the standard's too high, that the pattern of growth will expand. I mean, Brazil grew very rapidly until about the mid-'70s, more or less stopped dead in its tracks for 25 years, and now is growing and looking very promising.
We haven't listed those 13 countries. You don't have to reel them off the top of your head, but I did want to ask a cultural question, and to me, it's a fairly narrow one, in line with your demonstration effect idea, which is the ones that you've mentioned, I think, were Japan, Korea, Singapore, China. They're all in Asia. India would be another. It's in, I don't know what you want to call it. It's close to Asia. It's
Asia.
Yeah. So I wonder how much of this is a good kind of contagion, where the success of your neighbors puts pressure on you, or you learn from your neighbors. There's not a lot of success in Africa to be copied, or Latin America, or is there? Are there of the 13 countries? Are there any from Africa or Latin America that you remember?
Well, Brazil. It actually, in the immediate post-war period, was one.
Okay.
And Botswana is one. Botswana is still relatively poor, but they were very poor before. So Botswana is one. Oman is one. But you're right, the majority are in Asia.
Any thoughts?
India and Vietnam are sort of about to join the club, but they haven't been at it long enough yet.
But they probably will, as you say.
No, we spent a fair amount of time talking about that, as do other people. I think the honest answer is, in terms of definitive answers, we don't know. But it looks like the demonstration effects are more powerful, in kind of regionally, which means there's probably a cultural component to it. The reason it's hard to reach a definitive conclusion is because there are other factors. Let me just to state it starkly. One of the disadvantages most of the African countries have is that they're new, and they have a complex sort of tribal structure, and they haven't had a lot of years in building what you would call national identity. Meaning, and by that I mean nothing more complicated than, what group do the citizens think they belong to? Because, the underlying question is, when push comes to shove and things are going badly, do we all think we're in this together? And so these countries are still, in a sense, building that identity that, that we've been at for a couple of hundred years or more in the United States, that, China, in some sense, even though it wasn't developing economically, has been at for 2,000 years. So there's kind of deeper questions,
that's a good point.
About the politics and the cohesiveness and the sense of identity that underpin some of this, that then turn out to be constraints on sort of collective choice and policy decision making and investing and so on.
That's a very good point. What do you think are the most exciting areas in research on this topic of growth that people are exploring right now that have the most promise for understanding what's going on?
Well, I certainly think the work in political economy, meaning the interacting incentives created by the dynamics in the economy and the effect of the political and policy system on that, and vice versa, is A, important, and B, very promising. Not done yet. I mean, in the sense that you'd want to say we've largely finished that agenda, but I think that work is extremely important. Now, once you put the political system in the model, so to speak, and make it endogenous, then you're kind of, you see, most of us, when we think about economic policy, think, well, the government sort of policies are exogenous and then the economy reacts, so the models are about the economy, right? The political economy agenda is to make the politics part of the model.
Seems like
the policies.
Seems like a good idea.
Yeah, no, it's a wonderful idea. But then if you're talking to policymakers, they say, well, it's sort of like you're telling me that you've got a model that will predict what I'm going to do tomorrow. And so you start wondering about, well, so where are the levers?
Yeah.
What's exogenous in this?
Yeah.
And we had some fun with that. I think there are answers to that. And the answers will turn out to be interesting because the political economy agenda is real. There are constraints on politicians, and then I think the creative part in a developing country context has to do with sequencing things so that you can actually get them done without too much political resistance.
Yeah, I think of that as the recipe problem, that you might know the ingredients, and this is the problem I have with the Washington Consensus and any other attempts to sort of summarize what's going on. We have the ingredients. We don't know when to add what to what, or better yet, we don't really understand the process by which the dish gets cooked. So knowing the recipe but not the sequencing isn't all that helpful.
So, you mean knowing the ingredients? Yeah. No, we actually, because of Bob Solo, used exactly those words. We said these are ingredients, probably the ones we've identified we think are absolutely critical if you want the thing to taste good. But the recipes are all terribly country-specific.
Yeah, some things have to come first.
Except for the common ingredient.
Yeah,
right?
and some things have to come first in some places.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but nobody thinks that a country where the literacy rate is 40% is going to be able to grow at these rates. I mean, there's certain things that everybody agrees on. And nobody thinks that a country where you have to take a horse and buggy to get, inland to the farming area is going to grow at high rates. So it's not as if there's no knowledge, but the process of how you get there, and with very limited human and financial and other resources, what things you do in what order, I think is not something for which there's a formula. And if there is, we don't know what it is.
Let's talk for a minute about the practical aspects of the commission. It's issued two major reports. We're in the process of talking about one. I'll turn to the second one in a minute. But we're talking about the first one, which are these requirements for growth, success, some failure, some of the challenges. Yeah. What are the prospects that, it's an awkward question, but what are the prospects that people are going to listen to this? And does the nature of the commissioners being non-academic, for the most part, help or hinder it?
I think it helps. I mean, in part because, they're not anti-academic. That is, the commissioners are highly educated people that came to workshops, interacted effectively with the best of the academic world, and I think they probably started with a high level of mutual respect and ended up with an even higher one. So I think on that score, the commissioners and the kinds of people they represent are respectful of good academic and policy-oriented research, and conversely, I think the academics benefit, the best of the academics benefit from that interaction. I also think that because of who the commissioners are, that I find that the report seems to have a kind of a life of its own, at least in the developing world. And the fact that it's about the developing world means that it probably, from the point of view of kind of public attention, gets less attention in the advanced countries because a subset of people are interested and the rest that's kind of a different world out there. I mean, most of us have never lived in a country that was either very poor or growing at 10% a year.
Right.
So it's kind of out of the range of our experience.
Right. Let's turn to Haiti.
The most popular part of that report was the idea of one of the commissioners, and it's called Bad Ideas. And there's about 20 or 25 of them that was just meant to be kind of fun, as this one member of the commission said, you really got to say something, sort of kind of provocative. And this turned out to be kind of a smash hit. I started to get emails and letters, and things showed up in newspapers around the world, that sounded roughly like, I looked at this list of bad ideas, and our government was doing 18 of the 25 or something like that. It was quite fun. And I think it was actually, the benefit of hindsight, kind of a good idea to put it in the negative.
Yeah, well, that's the anti-demonstration effect. It's very important.
Yeah, it's the anti-demonstration effect.
A little humiliation. I want to let's turn to Haiti, and we don't know how horrific it's going to be, but what we're seeing right now is a statement about infrastructure that there's nothing there. I don't mean in the buildings. I mean in the government, in the normal channels that you would go through in a developed country. Now, part of that is due to the fact that so much has been destroyed, but a lot of it's due to the fact that it was not a very good system. And I think some people are talking about this as an opportunity to really alter the structure of Haitian government, society, etc. What do you think of those claims? And what can we do to help them, if anything?
Well, I think that the answer to that is that let me just make an observation that relates to what we were talking about before, and I'll answer your question directly. It's very difficult to change things, even when they're not going well. But when they're going horrendously badly, and you actually have a crisis, you frequently find that's the point in which there's a change. And the reason is, we suspect, that in a crisis, the constraints that normally operate get removed because of the negative situation. And there's lots of examples of that. Now, a crisis doesn't always produce good results, but it often does produce an opportunity. So, I think the opportunity people are talking about here is to make a massive effort to deal with an obvious crisis in humanitarian and every other term, but then keep going, and help Haiti get to a different level in terms of the resources that are available to them and in all the dimensions you mentioned, and hope that momentum, allows the people in Haiti to pick the ball up with fewer constraints and a brighter-looking future. Now, it's a tall order. I wouldn't want to bet that's going to happen, but I think, we have the resources because it's a relatively small country and a close neighbor of ours in North America, and lots of, relationships. Interpersonal ties. The Governor General of Canada is Haitian in origin, and so on. So I think there's a real reason to make, a supremely large effort, not just to help them get back on their feet, but to help them get to a different level as a starting point. And then at some point, as is true in every case, they're going to have to take it over and make the choices for themselves.
Seems to me the best thing we could do for them, though, would be to let the Haitians move to the United States. If we had a different welfare system, I think that would be an imaginable humanitarian solution. Right now, it seems difficult to understand how even to deliver the aid. It's an incredible challenge.
Oh, it's an enormous challenge. The problem, you're absolutely right. On a much broader scale, we looked at demographics. People have made the argument that you could sort of increase global GDP by 10% practically overnight, just by lightening up but overnight means over a decade-long period, just by kind of lightening up on immigration. But of course, that's right.
Yeah.
But it's also, immigration is a tough subject.
Well, part of it, I think it's natural that some people would be opposed to that on personal grounds. Others, I think, are opposed to it out of ignorance because they assume it would have to hurt us. Many people, of course, who are already here in the United States would be helped by having
absolutely
more folks here.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's good studies of that. I mean, the trick is to this is a really important sort of subject, from an international point of view, because there's quite apart from situations like Haiti, and I don't mean to divert us off it. Where young people are coming into job markets and where the jobs are simply don't match, at least in the short and medium run. And there's just a massive youth unemployment problem, which with a little imagination, we should think of as a kind of security problem on a global basis if it isn't dealt with. And, there's lots of countries where even the highest possible growth rates you can imagine, based on historical evidence, wouldn't really have the absorptive capacity with respect to these people. So we probably need, well-supervised ways that people can move to jobs that are more effective than the ones we have now. I mean, in a country like ours, people move to jobs and jobs move to people.
All the time, yeah.
In the global economy, jobs move to people, and that's partly why it works pretty well from the point of view of the developing countries. But people are much more constrained in moving to jobs.
Yeah, I meant to ask you this earlier when you talked about not letting the pace of creative destruction get too far ahead of the labor market. It seems to me we don't, as economists, have a very good understanding of the labor market. I mean, we have a sort of very, very crude understanding where we say things like, well, if you make it more expensive to hire people and fire people, there'll be less dynamic aspects to the labor market. Europe is less dynamic than the United States. But it seems to me there's something a lot more fundamental going on about how people feel about, risk and things we don't understand as economists or haven't even thought about. And one of the incredible advantages we have in the United States, even in this miserable economy we're in right now with 10% unemployment, is it's still a relatively dynamic place to be. And it's easier for employers to create jobs. And in these poor countries, creative destruction doesn't work the same way it works here. And there's a reason for that, and I don't think we understand it very well. And I don't know whether it's cultural, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's the legal environment, but it's a different thing.
No, it's very different. You're right. We don't understand it very well, and when we, and I in particular, went to look at it and listen to experts, it's incredibly complicated. But the barriers to incremental productive employment creation are partly man-made, for sure that. And it relates to the political economy discussion we are having. If you have as is common in many of these countries, you have a formal labor market and then a huge informal labor market that's somewhat less skilled, somewhat less educated. Very frequently you have, almost a dual economy situation. And if you try to fix that by reforming the labor market, which will come out sounding to the incumbents in the formal sector like inviting a few million competitors in for their jobs, they won't react very well. And if they have the political clout, and this varies from country to country, but it's not uncommon, to prevent that from happening, they will. And so you end up with this a set of what amount to barriers to the people who are not in the modern economy and in the highly productive part entering it.
We're low on time. I wanted to ask you about that second report, but instead we're going to put a link up to that for people who are interested, and it deals with the financial crisis and the global economic crisis and its implications for developing countries. I want to instead ask you, and we'll put a link up to the other report as well, but instead I want to ask you about something totally different, which you have a unique perspective on, which is Michael Spence. You have had a very unusual career. You started off as a very standard academic economist. You did extremely innovative, academic-oriented, sophisticated, mathematically, highest-level stuff. Then you went and you became the dean of a world-class business school. And you did that
Well, actually, I became the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard first.
Okay, so you made that.
President Bach.
Yeah,
President Bach's fault.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave out some. You can help me fill in the blanks here, but these are the ones I know about. So you were a fairly narrow, pardon the insult, academic economist. Then you were an academic administrator, the dean of arts and sciences. Then you changed gears and became the dean of a business school, which is people don't, I think, realize what an extraordinarily weird job that is. You've got a large faculty, all of whom see themselves roughly self-employed, but you're also raising enormous amounts of money. You're a public figure. So you did that. Then you win the Nobel Prize, which was real pleasant, I'm sure. And then you become what? Say that again?
I said it was wonderful.
Yeah.
Complete surprise. Yeah.
Congrats. And then you chair this international commission of a very different kind than most academics chair, because you've got all these practitioners and politicians. So I'm sure it's been a fascinating ride, but the question I want to ask you about that very diverse resume is, talk about what you learned. I think you probably are wiser than you were when you were 25. You certainly, I assume, think you're wiser. You probably really are. I'd be curious to know how you feel those different experiences shaped your understanding of the world, and which were more valuable, and what lessons you learned that you had to relearn or reject other things you thought you knew. Talk about that.
Well, I guess, I view myself as lucky in a way, to have these opportunities. But when I look back on it, when I became a dean at Harvard and then at Stanford, I was basically in a job that involved a certain amount of leadership and management, and a lot of interaction with people who, on the fundraising and alumni relations and related side, with whom I found I enjoyed getting to know them, getting to know what they did. I ended up on the boards of companies, which is a wonderful way to kind of have an inside view of what management thinks it's doing, what its challenges are. And when I sort of add that all up, and then the Growth Commission was an experience of a similar type, only these are, people that I hadn't really had a chance to spend a lot of time with, who are leaders in a kind of political and policy area, and that I hadn't spent time in the United States doing that. But I came to appreciate, I came to appreciate not only the people, but I came to appreciate how many different kinds of skills and capabilities and imaginations and intellects it takes, to run a successful society and a successful economy. Because I actually spent enough time with these people to either try to, in a very small way, do what they did, or at least interacting with them. And so I view it as a very rich experience, and now I sort of feel, when I sit back and think, or say to myself or to you, there's an enormously complex set of things that go into making a productive, innovative, rewarding, opportunity-full society. I feel like I have somehow acquired a real sense of what that means concretely over these 30, 40 years.
So how can the rest of us understand that without following your career path, which is a difficult strategy?
Well, I think everybody, in a way, has brushes with this. Nobody ever has the complete picture. That's one of the amazing things about our society, is that it manages to run, in circumstances where nobody, it's just physically and intellectually impossible to kind of grasp the whole thing. But I think people people's experiences actually give them a sense of this. Most people have involvements in either the institution that they're in or their communities that gives them a chance to do something quite different from what they do at work, and so on. My impression is that it would be hard to kind of. It's not hard. It's just choices, but to kind of reproduce any particular exact resume. But what I find is that young people are very creative, and they kind of have the advantage, I certainly think I did, of narrowness of focus. I was really fixated on, what the informational structure of markets and how that worked. But then as you get older, Russ, I think we all sort of you interview many people and learn a lot from a very wide range of people. We have contact with them. We tend to acquire administrative or community or managerial responsibilities, almost all of us, or a great many of us. And we acquire over time, it's not just the direct experience, but it's maybe we give up the innovative edge and focus and narrowness and acquire a kind of broader view. And a sense of how important people and their values are in making things happen. I think that's one of the most important things I learned. It wasn't just that the people knew how to do various things, but their leadership came from their values, their integrity, what they really cared about and communicated to other people.
Yeah, when you see that, it's so obvious how important it is, right? It jumps out at you.
Yeah, it is.
It overwhelms you. It inspires. But I like your point about focus because, it reminds me of what people say about entrepreneurs. I think Adam Smith said it, but it's obvious if you've ever dealt with entrepreneurs, as I did a little bit in my business school experiences, and you must have a lot at Stanford, which is, they have a grotesquely inaccurate assessment of their probability of success, which is a good thing usually because if they knew the real chances, they'd give up. And that narrowness of focus, the way I think of it sometimes, when you're in your 20s and 30s, particularly in academic life, you think you know everything often, it's a big handicap, but there's an advantage to it because you focus in on writing that paper or studying that subject. And as you get older, and in my case, a lot of it comes from doing this program and talking to a lot of really smart people, smarter than I am, you learn how little you know, and that's a rich and wonderful thing too. It's probably for the best.
Yeah, it is.
Probably for the best. It doesn't happen when you're 25. It's not a bad system.
I gave that when my youngest daughter graduated from high school. I went because I had been on the board, but I went and gave the graduation address, and so that was the hardest thing I ever did. I thought, what am I going to say to these 18-year-olds?
Sure.
And what I ended up saying to them was, I think you need to understand, and you probably already do, that you are entering the period where you're very powerful, but you're at your most creative. You are free of most of the constraints that come with conventional wisdom and a lot of experience piled up on top of it, and you should just take advantage of that. And, later on, you'll be wiser, there's no question about it, and probably more balanced than other things. So there is a natural cycle in these things, and you want to understand where you are in that and kind of throw yourself into it. And I think that's true. People in their late 40s and 50s have a pile of experience that they can rely on that's not there. And that's both an asset and a constraint.
For sure. You mentioned before we started this interview that the commission that you're chairing is not meant to last forever. It was started in 2006. It's probably going to end, quote, soon, whatever that means, but soonish.
Yeah.
You want to close and tell
of 2010.
You want to close and tell us what you might be doing next?
Well, I'm going to stay involved with things related to the global economy and the developing world, for sure. I think it'll be a combination of writing and research and teaching, I think, and then hopefully I will have a chance to stay involved with, the kinds of people I worked on in the commission at the country level and so on. I'm doing a little bit of that now. I try to get to India and China frequently. I'd like to spend more time in Latin America. I now have, friends and people that I can work with there. I think that the agenda is probably bigger than the time available. I'd love to get back to Indonesia. I think it's a fascinating and important country. The member of the commission who was from Indonesia, Dr. Bodiono, at the time was the coordinating economic minister. He then went to be the head of the central bank, and he is now the vice president of the country. And that was fairly common. People were switching jobs. But so I think that mix of things. I have tried to stay involved with the private sector with private companies and boards of public companies and some relationships in the investment world, because I find that focusing on the issues as they appear at that level, either in business or in an investing entity, kind of brings you down to earth. Or it's a nice compliment to the way the world looks from 25 or 30,000 feet.
My guest today has been Michael Spence. Mike, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you for having me on.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.